Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Miko. One of the things that I just wanted to do is quickly introduce myself. I've been traveling intensively, as Hans just mentioned. I was in, I guess it was yesterday, I was in New York meeting with a delegation from Malta, including the head of the Maltese Stock Exchange and the new financial regulator. It's very interesting what's happening in Malta. The financial regulator there used to be the regulator for the casino gaming industry. So it's a very interesting and novel set of legislation that they're passing in Malta. It's called the Virtual Financial Asset Legislation. So very interesting what's happening in Malta because Malta has so-called EU passporting, which means that if you get sanctioned and licensed in Malta, you have 500 million EU citizens that you can do business with. And if any country, let's say Germany, has a problem with what you're doing, you can just point to the Maltese government and say, you have a problem with them, not me, right? I'm licensed in the EU, right? So that's an amazing thing that's happening. We were promised that the legislation would be passed by the end of the summer, which is exciting. And there's a number of exchanges that have already announced that they're moving to Malta, including Binance, which should set up 400 staff in Malta. I had dinner last week with the CEO of OKX Exchange, which is now happily domiciling in Malta. I personally founded an exchange called Evercoin, and we are also looking at domiciling in Malta. So Malta is becoming a very interesting thing. And when you look at the most recent panel, we were talking about regulation. And I think one of the themes that surfaced was this kind of inter-domicile competition for crypto economics. So I think that that's a super interesting theme in crypto. And what we're going to see is the economic growth benefits accruing to the countries that are more receptive and open. So for example, in Japan, the financial regulator there, FSA, officially licensed 14 exchanges, and Japan now controls 38% of the cryptocurrency exchange volume on the planet. Now, it's partly due to regulatory friendliness. It's also in part due to the opposite, which is it's in part due to the unfriendliness of China. Right, so China has created an unfriendly atmosphere, and that traffic has moved to Korea and to Japan. So that's an amazing thing. Nomura Research did a study. I want to make sure I get this fact straight, which is Japanese economic growth of GDP has been small. So their typical growth has been a little north of 1%. It's not a fast-growing economy, unfortunately. If you take 3% of that growth for the year, that 3% of the 1% is attributable to cryptocurrency, which is a pretty astonishing result. And obviously, Nomura Research, very reputable firm. So just wanted to characterize a little bit about the global geopolitical landscape. And I think that exchange is actually a really fascinating topic, and there are some very big players getting into the exchange game. So I think we're in a mood now of what I call early majority. So we were in the mood of early adopter, and I think this most recent turn is reflective of an early majority mood in the technology adoption curve. If you haven't read Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, it is a Silicon Valley classic, and I think we're in that second inflection. So we're in that very interesting time. So I'm here to talk about what I call open source money, because I'm an open source money maximalist. How did I get there? So I really got started in Silicon Valley 25 years ago with the birth of the Java language. So I was part of the early Java language team. And nowadays, when I talk about Java, people think it's sort of like COBOL. It's like this old, boring language for doing boring things like running banks. So it kind of is. But, here I am. So I'm going to open with a question, which is this a good investment? It's a good question, right? So I had one really astute person in the audience answered, depends on when you got in.
And when you got out too.
And when you got, that's an even better answer. So now I've completed the circle. Depends when you got out, and I'll tell you why. This is Lehman Brothers, right?
Yeah.
So even if you got in at like $50 or whatever, even if you got in at $50, it still isn't a good investment. Because it basically went to that's very close to zero, right? That is vanishing. I don't think we've even seen a cryptocurrency go that close to zero. I mean, that's a complete disaster. This is $600 billion of balance sheet, by the way, that's been wiped out. That's wiped out. That's what that looks like. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of economy. And, this is what happened. This is September 15th, 2008, right? Very momentous day for the entire planet. This is what I refer to as a Humpty Dumpty moment. Because there's no coming back from this. So let us study the Federal Reserve balance sheet for credit easing. So everything looks great until September 15th, 2008. And as you can see, the vertical axis is trillions of dollars. Right? So look at the trillions of dollars that we're now, so this is what's happening. And if you actually look at the changes, we're talking about extraordinary long-term treasury purchasing, unprecedented mortgage-backed securities purchases. So these are really just unprecedented, irreversible changes to our government stability. And this is the date, right? So if you look at the date, what happened in the fall of 2008? What happened is something very irreversible. And the thing that's crazy is this. If you call this a Humpty Dumpty moment, like all of the king's horses and men are not even trying to put Humpty Dumpty back, right? It's continuing to be sort of an era of sort of profligate deficit spending and on anything, right? So to me, this is all based on magic money. We're $12.3 trillion of money printing downstream of September 15, 2008. That's a lot of printing. Just printing away. It's pretty impressive. $10 trillion in negative yielding bonds, right? That's painful to issue negative yielding bonds. It's like, why are we issuing those? Because they're pretty close to money equivalents, right? That's why we're doing it. And the reason we're doing it is that it's a big hole. Like if you want to fill a big hole, you got to print a lot of dollars and bonds. And 654 interest rate cuts, and we're starting to trend back the other way with that. And I think we were all staring into the gnashing teeth of inflation, right? Which is the kind of what happens when you reverse that curve. And it's a scary thought, right? And the thing that's amazing is, I'm going from the Humpty Dumpty to the Wizard of Oz, which is, there was supposed to be a wizard that was supposed to protect us from this, and it was Alan Greenspan, right? And what happened? The little dog pulled the curtain, and that was it, right? So now what? Now what? I mean, the conclusion that we experienced in The Wizard of Oz is that Dorothy now has to solve the problem herself. That's it, right? That's the whole thing. So, this is Bill Gates. He was asked in a Ask Me Anything channel, he was asked, will the US have another financial collapse? Right? So, his answer is, yes, it is hard to say when, but this is a certainty. That's unnerving, right? It's unnerving that Bill Gates is telling us that it is certain that we are going to have a large-scale economic collapse. So, what is a way of reasoning about economic collapse? So, I would like to go back to the seminal work. Essentially, there's this thing called self-organizing criticality that was complexity theory research by a guy named Dr. Per Bach. And he models this kind of state change theory and complexity theory as a pile of sand. And if you model a pile of sand and you continue to pour sand on the same spot, you get a bigger and bigger pile of sand. Makes sense? But along with the bigger sand, you also get bigger avalanches. And the avalanches are proportional to the slope. So as you pile more sand, the slope of the pyramid goes more vertical. And at some point, the probability of a large collapse increases. If you actually do this in a computer and you actually count and graph the sizes of collapse by the number of grains that are moved, you end up with a power law distribution of collapses. So in essence, this piling up and collapsing appears to be an emergent property of an extremely nonlinear system. And if you study like credit default swap behavior, and if you all watched the movie The Big Short, or if you read the book, there's no way for a regulator to stop that from happening. The system is doing itself. Like, people who are innovative are seeking alpha, right? And they're seeking alpha and they're building these systems to harvest alpha. And at some point, it becomes unsupportable. And so, to me, the thing that's very intriguing about the research is it turns out that one of the dimensions that allows you to govern collapses has to do with supportiveness, which is how supportive is each grain against the other grains. And it has to do with the shape of the grains. So for example, if you're pouring bricks, bricks are pretty supportive of other bricks. And so you can actually get a higher tower, right? If you're pouring marbles, marbles are kind of unsupportive because they just roll away, right? So that you'll get a lower stack, right? So the thing that's really interesting is when you're building things on top of kind of air, right? Like the thing that's amazing is if you look at credit default swaps, they're derivatives that are built directly on top of lending, which is built directly on top of home ownership, which is real estate, right? So we're talking about something that ultimately reaches the ground, right? Homes, properties, right? That's the collateralized asset. But the point is the leverage gets so ridiculous that it starts to disconnect from reality in a fundamental sense. And that triggers an extremely high valuation for that economy and a subsequently very large collapse. So I want you to think about this as sort of an emergent property and a way of modeling Bill Gates's inevitable collapsibility of traditional as well as novel crypto economies. So I want you to imagine that there's a person standing in a very high location, standing on a beam, maybe in a very precarious way, right? Watch the other foot. Watch the second foot. What's the percentage of weight on that foot? Probably not that high, right? Probably less than 50% of the weight on that second foot, right? So imagine that you're in this high place, and imagine that someone has placed a beam And imagine that someone who's wearing a t-shirt that says Lehman Brothers on it is walking across this beam and it collapses. And that person like plummets to their death. Right? So imagine that. Now imagine that the same person puts the same kind of beam across and asks you to walk across it. And now you're walking across the exact same kind of beam that you just saw collapse. Right? Now, what I want you to imagine is I want you to imagine that some dude that looks like this puts a second beam down, and it's made out of something that you've just never seen before. It's made out of some weird crashed UFO alloy. Right? You're like, what is this thing? What is this thing, right? So what am I talking about? So this is Satoshi Nakamoto. It turns out that, in fact, this is a man whose name is Satoshi Nakamoto. This is actually Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, who I think for a week was like Satoshi. And all the newspapers reported on it, and they were like, we found Satoshi. Turns out he's in the same neighborhood as like Hal Finney, which is super weird. It's a total coincidence. And his name is like, I think Satoshi is like, I think Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto that's him. Anyhow, we don't have an actual picture of the actual Satoshi Nakamoto, unless it's Craig Wright. Joke. But the point is this guy puts down this other beam, right? So what does a person do? Well, what a person does first is they look at the beam they're on and they say, this beam for sure is going to collapse, right? So they do what that skateboarder did, which is they just put their toe on that other beam, right? They're just checking it out. They're checking it out. So if you were to look at the macro economy of the planet, you could safely say that 0.5% of that weight has now been shifted into the crypto economy beam, right? It's not 50%. It's not much, honestly. And the question that you would have to ask is, if you were to graph the amount of weight on that beam, what would that graph look like? I'll tell you what it would look like. It would look like this. It would look like it would go up, right? And at some point it would kind of spike and then it would go down again, right? But then what would happen?
A little bit more weight.
It would come back higher, right? If you keep, and then and what would happen then? It would keep coming back higher and higher, right? Until maybe 50%, which would be astronomically higher than it is right now. But the point I'm making is this, is like when people say two things that make me crazy. One of them is Bitcoin is tulips, right? So if it's tulips, do you think the chart would look like that? Like, there's no way it would look like that. The way the tulip chart looks, it looks like this. It goes bananas, and then it crashes, and there's this crazy hangover where it's like, I don't ever want to see a tulip again in my life. Like, it's over, right? That's what it would look like. Doesn't look like that. So that's one thing that people say. Another thing that people say is that Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. That's what they say. So think about this. Think if you're a dude that's on a beam that's going to break and someone puts down a beam that might not break. Don't you think that would have some value? I mean, it would, wouldn't it? I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to necessarily make the case that the Bitcoin beam can't break because it's subject to the same laws of complexity theory. But what's interesting is that it's possible that it might break at a different time. And if that's the case, then you have metastability. And that means you have a decorrelated asset class. At the moment, we don't have that because we don't have proper Keynesian acceleration within cryptocurrency. So it's currently a bubble. And I don't think it's decorrelated as yet. But I think it could be. And as such, I think that that provides intrinsic value, which is that we have an alternative financial infrastructure based on open source, right, that competes with traditional financial infrastructure. If all it ever does is cause traditional financial infrastructure to perform better for people, it will have served a tremendously valuable mission. Because at the moment, pre-crypto, centralization of financial infrastructure had no alternative. There was no alternative, hence was a monopoly, hence was completely unmotivated to do anything differently. So, anyhow, rant over. But, you know, sometimes things get my goat when people say wrong things as if they're true. There's a book called The Book of Satoshi. It's awesome. It's really simply just a collection of Satoshi emails. And you can get it on audible.com, which I highly recommend, because it's a great audiobook. The only bummer in the audiobook is that the narrator reads out full Bitcoin addresses. It's insane. It's like capital S, lowercase r, the number 5. Like, okay, so that's a bummer. It's kind of funny too, but it's so good because if you read it closely, you can get into the mind of Satoshi. And I'm always trying to balance emphasis on Bitcoin and de-emphasis on Bitcoin, right? Because it's such a conundrum, because Bitcoin is so important in the sense that, like, do you think any of these things would exist were Bitcoin not to have existed, right? I mean, I think it's legit, right? It's super important. And I think the other thing that really gets my goat is people selling infrastructure ICOs based on the idea that they're smarter than Satoshi. And their proof point is that their blockchain performs faster, right? Like that just, that drives me crazy. It drives me crazy because I have a blockchain that will give you 1 million TPS. Anyone want to try me? I have it. I have the implementation. The implementation is an Oracle database sitting on top of, like, you know, Teradata with like 5 terabytes of RAM. And what I'm doing is I have this funny little, like, stored procedure that takes the transactions and forms blocks and changes the blocks together. Doesn't cost that much CPU. And I'm calling it a blockchain. And here's the amazing thing. The amazing thing about my delegated proof of stake model is that everyone just delegates all of their stake to me, to a single person. And I'm telling you, it's actually not that risky. And the reason why it's not that risky is I'm a great guy. But the thing that I'm proposing is the thing is you're only having to trust a single actor. You're not even having to trust a distributed network based on some game theoretical construct that people won't harm themselves and their self-interest. Like, you know, it's disturbing, right? I mean, you know, Monica Acquaintance, who I interviewed, she's one of the technologists behind the Cadena blockchain, says, I would rather be protected by thermodynamics, aka proof of work, than game theory. Because in game theory, it doesn't actually account for, like, extremely perverse motivations. Like, I'll give you an example, is why would someone collect most of a coin only to attack that coin and cause the coin to implode, right? What if that coin were a direct competitor to another coin? If you had coupled oscillators, if you had 2 coins that were related, you could deliver, if this coin were smaller and this coin were bigger, you could basically take a huge position here. Or even if there weren't paired coins, you could just go onto a futures market and short the hell out of it and then implode it from the inside, right? So the point is, We haven't figured this out yet. But the thing that bothers me is that people playing with the slider, which is the slider is this, right? Which is Bitcoin blockchain is what you get when you don't trust anyone. That's the hardest problem to solve. That's why Bitcoin's important, because it solved the hardest problem, which is the problem of what do you do if you don't trust anyone? If none of the endpoints trust any of the nodes and none of the nodes trust any of the other nodes. That's a hard problem. That is very, very hard. And it's solved beautifully. So point I'm making is if someone is plugging an infrastructure ICO on the thesis that they're smarter than Satoshi with the proof point that their blockchain is faster, they're just playing with a slider. Right? It's not like, oh, nobody's figured out how to get more than like 7 transactions a second. It's like, we know how to do that. Like it's, as an industry, we know how to make transactions fast. It's not hard. Okay. That's the problem that's been solved. And it's why I think Bitcoin is a foundational coin and why it's successfully been trusted to hold hundreds of billions of dollars in value in the manner of the beam where the weight is being distributed, right? Which is, it's not been hacked. Like according to the rules of Bitcoin, every transaction is exactly what happened. And no one has yet provably pointed to any transaction in Bitcoin and said, that didn't happen. Which is amazing. Count the number of transactions, count the total volume, dollar volume of all the transactions. It's unbelievable. And the fact that no one has been able to come forth and point at any transaction and say, that didn't happen, is that worth hundreds of billions of dollars? I think it is. So I described myself as an open source money maximalist. So what I wanted to do is just quickly walk through the mindset of open source software. So I've been involved in open source software startups. So this is the repository of Bitcoin, and that actor that's Satoshi. I think that's probably Hal Finney. And the thing that's great about this is this is not like a cartoon. This is actually, those are real pull requests and check-in of code, right? And this is really what the code base looked like. I think it was originally kicked off inside of CollabNet and not GitHub, but I think this is the source repository, and there's a date tracker at the top. So this is that's Gavin Andresen. Although what's weird is I think Gavin has 2 accounts, because that little photographic account, there's another account that says Gavin Andresen on it that pops up has a different graphic. But I guess the point being that this is what it looks like, right? This is what open source software development looks like. It's, in a sense, the development is mildly decentralized. If you read the book of Satoshi, you realize that there is an artificial centralization through the leadership of Satoshi. He's clearly an open source project leader. But as you can see, look at what is happening now, right? This is all kind of like Tom Sawyer painting the fence. These are all just people showing up and being like, I'd like to contribute to Bitcoin Core. And this is kind of what it ends up looking like, which is pretty astonishing. And what we haven't seen with this animation, and what the animation doesn't show, is it doesn't show forking, right? So you can just imagine what that looks like, which is just an entire cloning of the entire code base at the point of fork. And now you have 2 different chains, right? So pretty phenomenal mindset. So why illustrate this? To me, the reason why is open source money. And so let's reason about money for a second. So people are bad at reasoning about money, right? Like I played this trick. I gave a talk at a central bank, and one of the things I did there is I took a dollar, and I put it on the podium. And I basically, at the beginning of my talk, I said, that dollar isn't going to do anything, right? It's like, this is like dumb money, right? The money is not programmable. It has no inherent tendencies, no behaviors. And the thing that's amazing is that almost this is unlike almost all the money. And the reason why I say this is almost unlike all the money is this is no longer the rule, this is the exception. And what I mean by this is the exception is what is this, right? Most of the money isn't anything like this. Most of the money is software. So if you go to a Starbucks and you buy a cafe latte, right? Like, what do? So let's say you're paying with this, right? The thing that will happen is this is actually data. This isn't actually software, this is data. This is, right? And it's a representation of an asset, and what you do is you pay, right? But what happens after you pay with this? This gets converted into software, right? Which is cool, right? But what if you pay with a debit card? Then you're dealing with a different stack of software. What if you pay with a credit card? That's another stack of software mediated by the same hardware interface, right? Then what happens if you pay with a Starbucks gift card? That's a different stack of software. So the point that I'm making is the majority of money in the world is already software. So then the question becomes, if it is software, then what kind of software should it be? And I guess my thesis is, having watched the past 30-year history of open source software and proprietary software, the natural law and tendency is for open source software to dominate in regions where there's not a hot amount of innovation and development, right? So commoditized regions. So for example, PC operating systems, so things of that nature, right? So the point that I want to make is it has a tendency to eat proprietary software. So based on that metaphor and thesis, I believe that open source money will eat all of the proprietary money. So what does this mean? What are the implications, right? So first implication. So Paul Krugman in the New York Times said something annoying, which is he said, I'm paraphrasing, and it's probably super unfairly, and I'm sure he's incredibly intelligent, but paraphrasing him, his argument was, you can't buy a sandwich with Bitcoin, therefore, it is not money. Therefore, it is worth nothing. And therefore, it will crash to zero. Amazing. It's an amazingly flawed reasoning, phenomenally based on a model of money that money is essentially data and not software. Because if you're able to reason about money being software, what you begin to realize is that it is not monolithic. And the example I gave at Starbucks was, if you pay by a gift card, it's software A. And if you pay by a credit card, it's software B. And that the passion for there to be a single monolithic software package that represents all money is super nonsensical, right? So like Bitcoin is essentially a Swiss bank account, and I would love to watch someone buy a sandwich with a Swiss bank account using something like ACH protocol. Like, it would be awesome. Think about the fee structure, think about the time of resolution, think about all those things, right? And to me, like, it's almost equivalent to Bitcoin, right? I mean, the guy selling you the sandwich is like, you can hold the sandwich, but don't eat it until I get enough block confirmations. Like, it's nonsense. Like it shouldn't do that. And it wasn't designed to do that, and it never will do that in a perfect world. Right? It should not do those things. And it's okay that it doesn't do those things. Because in open source software, you have web servers, and you have databases, and you probably have in GitHub some kind of stupid web server database. But nobody cares, because it's a stupid thing. Like, it shouldn't exist, right? And so the whole idea of a Bitcoin for buying sandwiches, I think Bitcoin Cash is supposed to be that. It's like a web server database. Like, why? Like, why do you need it to do all the things? that isn't how money is already. So like, why would you ask it to do that? So so Bitcoin will eat all the money, starting with Bill Gates. No, I'm kidding. Bill Gates is the smallest Pac-Man dot, so that's why he's there about to be eaten. But it isn't really. It's no ding on him. I think he's an awesome dude, and he's been doing great things with his money. So anyhow, so this is just a visualization. And what I want to say, so people also say, how can Bitcoin keep increasing in value? Right? They're just confused. They're like, that's unbelievable. That's unimaginable. How is that even possible? So it turns out that the application of Bitcoin is principally a store of value with the ability to transmit the value electronically over long distances without the help of trusted intermediaries, which is kind of neat. And it's a big mouthful. But I want to come back to store of value, which is, it turns out that fiat currencies are terrible stores of value. So if you look at the buying power of USD since 1913, and by the way, like, look at how quickly it went down, right? So in 10 years, it actually got cut in half. So if you just look at that stretch right there, pretty painful stuff. Great Depression. But since 1913, it has lost 95% of its value. Now, I don't want to pick on the US dollar. I think it's a useful currency. And in fact, all of them do this. They all do this. But the point I want to make is people measure the value of Bitcoin using USD. And so they're measuring the value of a thing with a ruler that's shrinking. So the ruler is getting smaller. It's kind of like if you're sitting in a train and the other train starts to move and you're like, oh, my train is moving. Right? It's really just a trick of perception. Now, I'm playing a game with you all because like the time scales don't quite match. Right? Like the ascent of Bitcoin and the time scales that we're talking about, like it's just the tail end of that graph when it's just dropped a little bit, right? But the macro point is still valid, right? The macro point is that these money printing engines are by design unsustainable, and that's fine. But if you do want to store value, you can do so, and that's good. Right? So the reason why I'm framing it in such a like alternative construct is that if you study the history of open source, the open source software industry has not eliminated the proprietary software industry. And in fact, the proprietary software industry is worth more today than it's ever been worth in the history of the world. So I'm not a person to tell you that fiat currencies will go away in favor of open source. They won't. They won't go away. In fact, they'll persist. They have a bunch of killer applications that I think are unreachable by today's cryptocurrencies. And the killer applications are that fiat currencies have backing. That's a big secret. If you look at 1971, the bimetallic standard backing was removed. But I'll tell you what the backing it does have. It has the backing of laws, it has the backing of guns, it has backing of prisons, and it has backing of taxes, right? And if you want to talk about two things that are inevitable, death and taxes, right? That's a lot of juice. And those are killer applications for any currency. So to me, the only way that a cryptocurrency chases out fiat currencies is a national cryptocurrency. Right? So you're seeing things like crypto ruble, and you're seeing these emergent. Marshall Islands has a cryptocurrency that's designed to compete with USD. So like it's starting to happen, and those will be backed by taxation, legislation, ammunition, the whole 9 yards, incarceration. Hey, I just made that up. All that stuff rhymes. Anyhow, but you know, Bitcoin won't unless someone wants to start a decentralized prison. A DAO, that would be cool. Decentralized police force. Anyhow, it would be interesting. So what is downstream of this investment in Bitcoin? What's naturally downstream of it is this pattern of diversification. So what I wanted to show you is a quick little animation on the ICO marketplace, right? So what you're seeing in the middle is a $19 million ICO. You could get Ether for 14 cents. That was a pretty nice ICO. And in fact, the panel mentioned it earlier. It does seem clear from the reading of the DAO that Ether is not considered a security even by the SEC, which is kind of an anomaly. And I think the recent words of SEC Chairman Clayton relate to that, which is he said that things can tilt from utility to security based on usage. Right? So I think what he's effectively saying was, there's the DAO. He was saying, hey, Ether was maybe a security at one time. It probably isn't right now. It's an interesting interpretation. So here we are in kind of spring of 2017 when things start to cook. And you can see EOS, you can see Tezos, you can see Filecoin, you can see Bancor, you can see a few bigger ones. And this only takes us to late fall of 2017, right? And so this particular chart governs 6.39 billion USD, and the party has continued, right? Like there's a number of other sizable ones that are not included, right? If you wanted to include Telegram in here, Crypterium, if you want to include any of the more recent ones of size, I'm working on lottery.com, which is targeting, I think, about 300 million, which will be a little bigger than that Filecoin one. Should be an interesting one. And I think you're going to see much bigger. I wrote a blog post a while back that said the $1 billion ICO is coming. I didn't know who it was going to be, but boom, it's here, right? So what is this phenomena? Right? How can we reason about this? I think here's a chart that shows a logarithmic scale of the sizable offerings. I mean, it's log, so like it looks a lot flatter than it is in reality. And one of the things that's no longer that fashionable are the very large raises based on kind of vapor, based on kind of, so I think the Bancor, Tezos style white paper large raise thing it's not fashionable anymore. But of late, I've been referring to the ICO market as the San Francisco Valentine's Day pillow fight. And the reason why this metaphor holds for me is because this is not a very good chart, but because it's out of date. But there's a little tiny slice at the top that's called ICO. And it's really a thought exercise. And this is a moment in time. Bitcoin dominance is way lower now, so I need to remake this chart. But the main point of the chart still applies, which is if you take the entire crypto ball and you give away $6.4 billion of crypto, you're okay. Right? Like you're not in a panic. It's not that scary of a thing to do, right? Because you're really just taking a huge thing and you're diversifying it further and creating a little bit more robust diversification, right? And to me, the thing that's intriguing about this diversification is you could think of it as a talent grab. So $6.4 billion talent grab, and it's captured a lot of incredibly smart, talented people, right? One of the things, I hosted a fireside chat with Vinny Lingham, the CEO of Civic and Bitcoin Foundation board member. He made a good point to me, though, and his good point was if you're going to grab all the talent, you have to pay them salaries, which we're doing. So the thing that's interesting about, if you look at the ICO crypto ball, fascinating thing that we're experiencing now is kind of the runway phase, which is the run, and that's why I think we're going to inflect, which is the runway phase actually looks negative, but it is positive. And what I mean by it looks negative is here's what it looks like. What it looks like is it looks like most of that money that was raised is actually now dumping to fiat. And it's like, why is that happening? It's happening because there's a lack of a Keynesian accelerator in crypto, which is essentially that people want their salaries to be in fiat so that they can pay their rent in fiat and they can buy their groceries in fiat. And, right? So the employees that are being hired by the crypto cabal are essentially exiting crypto to fiat, which is actually kind of causing a decrease in value, right, of the cryptos, which is a de facto economic decrease in the value because people are selling at scale, right? But the reality is that, like the dot-com boom, we're gonna see some winners, right? Out of the thousands of ICOs, there will be 5 or 6 of these things that start tractioning according to a Metcalfe's law value curve. And the natural size of those will be their total addressable markets, right? Which is that, to me, some entrepreneur asked me, they were like, should I do an ICO? So I was like, that's the wrong question. The right question is, should I incentivize my community to add value to my network? That's a better question. Whether that involves an ICO or not, I mean, it probably would. I mean, that's a great way to kickstart the value of that network. But the reason why I think that's a better question is if you don't incentivize your community to add value to your network, your competitor will be doing that. And all of your community will go over there because you're not incentivizing them properly and they are, right? So it's a very interesting thing. So to me, if we get 5 ICOs that get some form of that Metcalfe's law style traction, we're in the second phase of crypto. We're in early majority crypto. And to be honest, we're seeing crazy things happening. We're seeing like 100 million user internet apps looking at injecting crypto wallets, right? That's an order of magnitude more wallets than we have today that could be embedded in a single app, right? So it's amazing. So that's a sign of early majority, as is regulation. So to me, I feel like we're in that kind of weird adolescent chasm crossing phase where we're burning a lot of the ICO cash. And we're raising more, but we're also burning what we got. And we're burning it so that we can build software. And almost all of the software that we're building is junk. But some of it is not junk. And that will be amazing. It will be amazing to see the not junk things start to do what they were born to do. So I just wanted to kind of close on a different angle or a different note, which is I started this nonprofit organization called the ICO Governance Foundation, or IGF. You can see it at icogovernance.org. And I want to hearken back to that metaphor of the self-organized criticality associated with the sand pile, right? And if you go back to this notion of the collapse and the inevitability of collapse in the sand pile, the governing principles, obviously there are additional variables to this construct, right, that are all interrelated, like things like the slope of the sand pile, right, which is related to things like the speed of the piling of the sand, but it's also related to the structure of each individual grain. So what I wanted to pull all the way back to is the structure of each individual grain. So imagine that we're laying bricks. So if each ICO is a brick, then we'll get to a much higher level. And what is the property of a brick? The property of a brick is that it is an ICO that is supportive of other ICOs, right? Because a brick is a shape that's supportive of the other shapes, right? So if you look at things, I'm just going to pick EOS as an example. I hold EOS. Like their ecosystem that has 2 venture funds that will invest in ICOs that will launch on top of them. Take a look at something like Stellar, right? Obviously, the Ethereum blockchain has been insanely supportive of other token sales. And we're just seeing more of these things emergent, NEM ecosystem out of Japan. Then there will be more and more, right? So what does an unsupportive entity look like? So I mentioned marbles. So if you're pouring marbles, you'll never get a sand pile. They'll just keep, because none of them are supporting each other. So you could look at something like a scam ICO as like a marble. And what happens if you mix bricks and marbles? Right? If you mix bricks and marbles, it pretty much acts like marbles, right? Because the marbles are just sliding the bricks and you're not getting anywhere, right? So to me, what that means from the perspective of getting a higher pile is that I think we need to, first of all, find a mechanism to eliminate these economic free riders that are scam ICOs. And the proposal that I have is very simple, which is a disclosure protocol. And the disclosure protocol is basically, it's super simple. It's all about it's all about use of proceeds. So it's like, what are you going to do after you get the money? And it's all about who is getting paid by whom, under what circumstances, using what mechanisms, right? And who controls that pinball machine going forward, right? That's all it is. Those are the disclosures. And to me, my goal, I spoke to a game theory professor, and he educated me on what my goal was, which is he said that my goal is to establish a positive Nash equilibrium. And the way I frame it is I want it to be like a presidential tax return, which is, I want it to be, if you don't disclose it, for sure you're hiding something, right? I want it to reach that level of social norm. And the way I want to get there is self-regulation. And part of self-regulation is, if you all are investing in a token sale and you haven't asked them who is getting paid out of the proceeds, how much, when, for what reason, and what's the mechanism? Is there token vesting? Is there milestone-based payments? What are the founders getting? When are they getting it? Who's in charge? Are there any fiduciaries at all? Are the tokens completely custodied by the founder's pocket? Are they the only holder of the private key? Is there any escrow? Like, all these questions are just, it's super simple. And I just want everybody to just ask those questions. And if there's enough peer pressure, then it'll flip. And this game theory professor said to me something very intriguing, which is he's a Russian guy. And he said this. He said, in Russia, the traffic cops take bribes. And in the United States, the traffic cops do not take bribes. And he said this. He said, it has nothing to do with individual cops. It is a Nash equilibrium. And what he said is, he said that in Russia, if you don't take a bribe, then you have nothing to kick back to your superior. And the way that the government pays these people is insufficient for them to remain alive. So like, they have to have the bribes. And if you don't give a bribe to your superior, a kickback, you're fired, right? In the United States, if you do take a bribe, you'll be found out and then you'll be fired. So the point that he's making is that it is a positive or negative Nash equilibrium. So that's really the mindset that I have behind establishing these norms. And I think that the industry is ready for some amount of self-regulation, because ultimately we want to have a self-supporting, self-regulating construct. And if we don't, we will have regulations put upon us from top down. And I think that's not optimal. So that's my kind of last appeal. If you need to check out projects that I'm working on, it's all there at miko.com, miko.com. And you can also get in touch with me there if you want. So thank you very much.